Thank you so much. It's a great honor to participate in this annual conference as moderator of this session. This session title is Educating for Ecological Awareness. We have two wonderful presenters, Professor Procario-Foley and Mr. Von Nelson. Each presenter uses 30 minutes or 40 minutes, and last 10 minutes we will question and discussion. I will introduce myself. My name is Dr. Moon Son. I am teaching Christian education at Yonsei University in Korea. I participate in annual member of REA I participate in the 2020. So I'm very happy to be a member of REA. I'm proud of it, always. So I introduce Professor, first session presenter, Professor Procalia Foley. He serves as Executive Director of the Center of Mariandale Retreat and Conference Center in Ossining, New York, not far from New York City. He is also an adjunct professor at Iona College. He received his doctorate from Fordham University's Graduate School of Religion and Religious Education. His paper explores the meaning of ecological conversion as well as the practices of faith communities in cultivating spaces for such conversion to flourish. We want to discuss questions to consider: how might communities of faith foster authentic, integrated ecological convergence that advance the culture of care for the earth? And first presenter start, please.
Well, thank you, Dr. Moonson. Very good to be with everyone this evening. I am Procario-Foley. I join you tonight from the banks of the Hudson River in the ancestral land of the Sinsink and Lenape peoples, and where today the center at Mariandale is. It's a retreat and spirituality center sponsored by the Dominican Sisters of Hope. And so today I want to talk about practicing a holistic vision for ecological conversion. You know, since the publication of Pope Francis's landmark encyclical Laudato Si, there's been a robust discussion among religious educators about this notion of ecological conversion. And so this paper draws on some of this rich scholarship and makes some attempt to move from the what of ecological conversion to the how. And so that is really, how do communities of faith foster ecological conversion in holistic and integrated ways, honoring the depth and the breadth of this important process of transformation. My interest in this topic does stem in part by my practitioner interests as an executive director of a retreat and spirituality center, really committed to the care of the earth and practices that promote that. My scholarly background is been in the evolution and the impact of Catholic social teaching, particularly the notion of solidarity and also its manifestation as environmental solidarity. I also write from the perspective of a deep pastoral concern for how do we teach and proclaim care of the earth, and a deep concern that we're not teaching and proclaiming care of the earth as we should. And finally, my own personal formation is raised to be in awe and wonder of creation. Jennifer Ayres important text, Inhabitants, Ecological Religious Education, speaks of, despite environmental challenges, human beings live in a world of wonder and creativity, a world with a power to evoke human awe, bemusement, joy, curiosity, grief, love, imagination, and longing. It was awe and wonderment that inspired me on this topic in my many, many years of spending time hiking these hills, the majestic mountains of New Hampshire, the land of the Abenaki and the Pequawket, land which my mother taught myself and my brothers and sister to love and to really cherish and to care for. And some of the sources, these ecclesial sources on ecological conversion that I cite, from Pope Benedict to Jean Paul to Pope Francis, some of the academic sources that I'm drawing from, an important piece by Neil Almirad and Christina Vannon, Tim Hanchin and Christina Hurlson's works, Maria Teresa de Villa, Daniel Castillo, academic religious education, Stephen Brookfield, Mary Hesson, James Loader, Tom Groom, Maria Harris, some of the indigenous wisdom, certainly Robin Walker, a public intellectual and syndicated columnist, Margaret Rankel. It was in a recent New York Times editorial, Margaret Rankel mourns the illegal cutting down of a 250-year-old black walnut tree, that stood several feet outside the property line of the perpetrator's land, as claimed by a Cayuga County prosecutor. "It's ours. I just don't understand any of this," was the response of the brother and sister charged with the grand thefts, falsification, and felony crime. And Rankel confirms the need for ecological conversion when she says, to truly protect trees, we need to make a profound paradigm shift that transcends politics. We need to stop thinking of trees as objects that belong to us and come to understand them as long-lived ecosystems temporarily under our care, our protection. We have borrowed them from the past and we owe them to the future. Evokes Thomas Berry's work, and Thomas Berry reflects the great work of our time and eschews a radical discontinuity between the human and non-human world, an attitude that assumes that humans have rights and non-humans only have rights insofar as they relate to humans. How can one say that about this owl that sits perched on a tree not so far outside my window? And Pope Francis likens our common home to a beloved family member when he says, this sister now cries to us because of the harm we've inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We've come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, and in all forms of life. So for Pope Francis, ecological conversion is truly a change of heart. It's a process of becoming painfully aware, deep within oneself, to dare to turn what is happening in the world into our own suffering. And so Pope Francis is very quick to point out that ecological conversion is not a superficial ecology. He is somewhat critical in his remarks about green rhetoric and only a public policy interests. That, again, ecological conversion, and Jennifer Ayres really speaks about this, about how we cannot attempt to complete the process of ecological conversion having taken one environmental class, that this is a process that challenges us to really examine our souls and our relationships and interconnectedness with the earth. And not only with the earth, with the cry of the poor on this earth. Maria Teresa Davila speaks of the option for the poor as really the hermeneutical key for understanding Pope Francis's Laudato Si. She cites that the words excluded and vulnerable and poor are mentioned some 65 times, as much as the word creation. Without understanding the reality of the poor, then it's difficult to have any type of genuine ecological conversion, according to Davila. And Christine Lang Hurlson really emphasizes the same point when she talks about deconversion from consumerism. You know, consumerism as a faith system that deems deconversion as absolutely necessary. And she speaks about visual imagery as a way to really introduce new narratives and authenticate ecological disaster. She elaborates on a film on plastics and its impact on the birds. She draws a lot from the work of Kate Turpin and her discussion of the saturation of images of materialism as a formation system that shapes adolescent conversion. And here at Mariandale, where I am, a lot of our work here is involved in inviting young people into that intersection of the cry of the poor and cry of the earth as they work here in our organic gardens, as they explore our trails, but also as they share the fruits of that garden with the hungry of our community. Many suggest that perhaps we should employ a doomsday approach to ecological conversion. But Jennifer Ayres and many others warns against doomsday approaches, which only serve to scare people, to provoke anxiety, and possibly lead people to inaction due to their state of fear. Anyone who works in the university context knows the crippling power of anxiety, and certainly the escalation of climate anxiety on our earth is something that we have to address and deal with and attend to. Timothy Hanchin and Christine Hurlson also speak about an ecstatic pedagogy for promoting ecological conversion. And such a pedagogy would truly promote the mystical connection with the earth, a very much a Trinitarian approach, an approach which involves one's whole being in relationship to the earth, a union with all. And they suggest pedagogy that promotes a holistic communion with the textures of the natural world, so that alienated mechanistic view of the world withers away. And so the dynamics of conversion, Omerod and Vannon explore the work of Bernard Lonergan and the different dimensions of conversion that Lonergan points to: religious, moral, intellectual, and psychic conversion. And certainly James Loder and Stephen Brookfield have talked about conversion being provoked by conflictual situations that engage one in a whole process of reimagining who they are in relationship to the world. And so the question is, how does this happen? Does this happen through ecstatic conversion? Does it happen through an exposure to kind of a visual contrast experiences? Does it happen through anxiety? Does it happen through being scared about the world that we live in? One of the things that Inhabitants really emphasizes, the work of Jennifer Ayres, is an integrated vision of religious education that engages a deliberate process of formation for the whole person and for whole communities. And this draws to mind the work of Maria Harris for me, and her work on curriculum. And how does Maria Harris's work on curriculum, how can it possibly be a container by which we might, a lens by which we might look at this topic of ecological conversion? And of course, for Harris, Harris, is very much uses the emphasizes the Elliot Eisner focus on explicit, implicit, and null curriculum. And so she's attentive to that, as we might be attentive to that as we look at these categories, these forms of curriculum. And so, as we know, Harris's forms are community, worship, proclamation, teaching, and service. And so when we ask ourselves about community, how do faith communities promote ecological conversion? We think of community as that powerful unifying force, which really identifies a house of worship. And Daniel Castillo speaks of Pope Francis's Laudato Si as really expanding this notion of community, this notion of Christian love from the Gospels and the biblical tradition, to include God, one's neighbor, and the non-human world. And Pope Francis does engages in this exegesis of the Cain and Abel account. He elaborates upon this sense of the cry of the earth, and that the earth is engaged in all these interactions, and so that the earth, the whole notion of community must constitute the earth. And so it begs the question: how do our faith communities name the earth? How do we name the terrains? I am in the terrain of the Hudson River watershed. What terrains define us? Who's in the communion of saints of our faith communities? The indigenous who inhabited the land, the queer ancestors of our communities that last night's workshop so eloquently, beautifully pointed to. Should land be its own form? Should we expand Harris's framework of curriculum to have a category just focused on land itself? Or does community do the trick? Do we embrace this understanding of community that Castillo has elaborated upon based on Pope Francis's work? Teaching. Harris challenges educators, of course, to consider the null curriculum, that which is taught by what is not done or said. So what might be that in our community? What's the null curriculum about the earth and about ecological consciousness? Is it about alternative energy? Is it about composting? Is it about the ancestors who are unnamed? What is the null curriculum? Hanchin and Hurlson, advocate for teaching pedagogies that promote connected knowing, interconnecting the head and the heart, expressing thoughts and feelings. And this is what I was thinking about a bit as we just talked about kitchen table conversations in the last presentation. Immersions, advocacy, community gardens as teaching, ways of teaching that our faith communities may be pursuing in different ways. And worship, Harris talks about the curriculum is in the praying. Some of us in the Christian tradition may be familiar with the season of creation and celebrating the season of creation, September 1 through October 4. Some have suggested that the Ignatian spiritual exercises contain this element of election that could be considered ecological election, a decision to care for the earth after weeks of clarifying how one sees and serves God in creation. And then, of course, there's so manifold practices of deep listening to and seeing of creation, and so much indigenous wisdom which teaches us about that. How does the service of our faith communities link the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor? Do people engaged in this service understand, embrace, and enter into that link? How much are for those of us in traditions which promote the sacramental life, how much are those sacramental preparation grounded in the earth? Aaron Loths, who environmental ethicist who recently presented here at the center, talks about sacramental acts might be expanded to include acts of eating less meat, acts of utilizing public transportation, gardening and composting. How might we imagine, how do we teach and talk about sacramental acts? Are they acts of service of this nature? Ayre speaks of a deliberate formation of care for the earth. To what extent does the service that we promote at our communities of faith reflect such deliberate formation? We know that the preaching of the word is delivered not only from the pulpit, but also through the lives of the faithful who proclaim the gospel through acts of compassion and justice and through lives of simplicity and truth. The notion of kerygma comes from the prophetic tradition as the calling to speak the word of God as a dynamic entity. Curricula very much engages and involves proclamation. Hurlson elaborates on the important scripture passage that's preached in every liturgical year on the Christian tradition. That is Jesus's injunction to receive the kingdom as a child, issuing a twofold mandate, so apt in this time of climate crisis. So the scripture challenges adults to do all they can do to save the planet and thus future generations of children. But also this command of Jesus is a call to recover one's childlike nature, one's openness, one's receptivity, one's humility, and love of the small things in life, all qualities of a ecological conversion. So in closing and offering this framework of Harris as a potential way for us to look at how we promote ecological conversion in our faith communities, I'm reminded of Kieran Scott's work, who says that church-based education might hold in tension the sacramental and prophetic in a creative, imaginative space as the life-giving dynamic needed at the center of teaching and learning. And so Harris's 5 forms provide this holistic container for the sacramental and prophetic dimensions of ecological education to take root and to expand. And the insights are really only the beginning of what could be an extensive and thorough religious education that provides the fertile ground for an integral ecological conversion. Religious educators cannot control how conversion might take place. That's rightly the work of the Spirit. But religious educators can indeed provide that fertile ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Professors, a wonderful presentation. In his paper, he explores the meaning of ecological conversion. He focuses on the ecological conversion and the practices of faith communities in cultivating spaces for such conversions to flourish in the holistic category of the Maria Harris curriculum framework. He is interested in our questions. How might communities of faith foster authentic, integrated ecological convergence that advance a culture of care for the earth? I hope listen and talk question about these questions. Presenter.
Is this the time to ask questions?
Yes.
Because I put up my hand. Thank you very much. Professor Carl Procario, I hope I got your name right. My name is Remigius Mabichie, and I've been working on the philosophy or a philosophy for Christian religious education. And one of the difficulties of defining philosophy is that philosophy has no universally accepted definition. And that is the case because philosophy is very averse to prescription. And in the paper that Professor Carl presented and similar in the curriculum development, I am kind of worried that we are where we are right now in this in the state of affairs, is the state of the ecology, is precisely because generations before us, especially the 20th century, or should I say, since the post-Enlightenment era, has been more or less prescriptive in the application of philosophy for Christian education. For instance, I make the distinction between Christian missionary Christian education and the Christian religious education. I make a distinction between the two, and I recognize Christian missionary education as colonial and neo-colonial, and it was very prescriptive. We were using the schools, using the churches to convert people, indigenous people, and channel them to a certain direction, conversion, exploitation of their resources, operation, make them subservient to us. And this was the kind of education that was afforded in these past 3-4 centuries, thanks to the post-Enlightenment might is right. Now, if we are to reverse that, if we are now going to go into a post-Christian missionary era, into a Christian religious era, a Christian religious education for me is liberating and liberatory, right? How might we avoid the danger of being prescriptive in this new era? I know we want to be ecological conversion. Doesn't that fit into the model of being prescriptive of what Christian religious education is? I have a difficulty. Could Professor Carl Procario comment on that? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your question. I think, you're really getting at sort of the baggage of colonialism. This word is conversion is absolutely, it has a lot of history and baggage to it, right? And this prescriptive dimension to it has been the source of pain and suffering of many. I do feel that and it's interesting, this language, I would say that, I do feel like the curricula that Maria Harris and others have proposed is very much an invitational one. It's very much a suggestive one. And so I think, I would say that, and I do think that the situation that we're in on in the earth does warrant us to wake up to the reality of the signs of the times, that we need to be attentive to those signs of the times in our teaching and name them. So I understand the challenge and the tension that you are speaking to, and I think we have to walk that challenge, and so.
Thank you.
Professor Nolan? Professor Elizabeth Nolan, and provide some question too.
I have two quick comments. One is, I believe to avoid being prescriptive, one can use the questioning method. So by asking the ultimate questions, the bigger questions and the smaller ones, by posing questions as the core starting point for your curriculum, you can then say, well, what are the multiple answers to these questions? So you're not being prescriptive saying, this is the tradition that answers, but you can get your students to look at the variety of answers that have come. And so religious education becomes that dialogue between the ultimate questions of life and the answers that the religious tradition provides. I can talk more about that if you want to, but I would like to invite Maureen O'Brien, because I believe she has been doing some of this liberating ecological education, and I'd love Maureen to get into the conversation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I guess I'd say I've taken some baby steps in that area. I've just what I've done most intentionally in undergrad teaching, and I also have a question for Carl too, with his long experience with undergrads. But in some of my undergraduate teaching that proceeds from the Catholic tradition of faith and reason, it's been a kind of interesting direction to start with, because the Catholic tradition of faith and reason insists that those two things are compatible, that they're, that they don't stand at odds with each other. And so I've in teaching about that, then I've tried to go from that to the present situation, particularly in reference to climate change, and to look at the ways in which we can take this kind of conviction that our faith and reason converge into, for example, scientific developments and the knowledge we now have about the realities of anthropogenic climate change. So, so that's one way I do it in an undergrad course. What I was wanting to ask Carl more about was, I really loved, Carl, the way you used Maria Harris's 5 dimensions there, and I am really interested to hear more about the work you're doing at the center. I was getting a sense in reading the paper that you felt a certain tension in terms of ecological conversion between, let's say, a more organic, formative approach and a more conflictual approach, as in like provoking, instances in which questions become so urgent that we might be brought to that about face, more of the loader kind of approach, I guess I'd say. So I'm wondering, as you engage with your young people at the center, and you mentioned the community gardens and the various ways you do, where do you find yourself leaning? Do you find yourself doing what Elizabeth was talking about in terms of the questions you raise with the young people? Do you find that you do want emphasis on one element of Harris more than another one? Do you find you want to provoke or to reassure, or how do you balance all that? Because I struggle with that in myself, let alone with my students.
Well, thanks, Maureen. And yeah, we are having a lot of groups of young people come for alternative break immersions, and we try to mix the experience up so that they're indeed engaged in advocacy, meeting with advocacy organizations about the river, about the South Bronx, about different things like that. But we also provide a lot of time for folks to also engage in kind of a contemplative practices of listening and listening to the tree, learning from the trees, and caring for the natural. So it's kind of that mixture that is, and I guess that's more of a pedagogy of trying to appeal to sort of the diverse ways that people are affected and influenced, mind and heart, as you said, faith and reason, as well.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much for so very good questions and good responses. This is the second presentation by Mr. Nelson. The presentation's title, How Food Teaches and Why It Matters for Religious Education. I introduced Mr. Vaughn Nelson. He is a rising first-year PhD student in practical theology at Boston University School of Theology, with an emphasis in religious education. The focus of his research is the role of food in religious education and formation. He is interested in the way spiritual, moral, and identity formation happens through various cultures and practices of eating, and he explores ways that food cultures and alternative food practices participate in construction of whiteness and coloniality, and also how they are sources for disrupting those systems. In essence, he is working on ways that food can be engaged as a creative, aesthetic, and embodied mode of teaching and learning about religion, self, and others. Along with his specific focus, he has also engaged with theologies of liberation, disability theology, theological anthropology, service, adult learning and education, aesthetic pedagogy, and theology, and critical and public pedagogy. Vaughn is an ordained pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist denomination and served congregations in Southern California for 14 years prior to entering doctoral work. He lives in Loma Linda, California, with his partner Becky and their dog Minsky. Thank you. Present your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Munson. I'm going to share my screen here. Arrange the windows. Well, I'm so grateful to be here with you all, and grateful to be sharing this time with Carl as well and his wonderful paper and presentation. One thing I want to do in my presentation time is in keeping with the conference's theme and with the spirit of the opening session about ancestors. I was going to say that I want to name a few of the REA ancestors on whom my work in this paper is dependent, but then realized these are very much living and contributing and active ancestors, maybe some in the room. And I thought I don't want to be probably referred to as an ancestor anytime soon. So maybe another way of putting this is that I want to name some people whose work helps me imagine the kind of ancestor I want to become. But first, I'll do a brief summary of the paper. In a way, a big part of what I'm doing in the paper is drawing on two pieces of wisdom from other sources outside of religious education, from two distinct areas of scholarship that focus on food. And I'm asking how those two pieces of wisdom might influence a religious education that approaches food as an opportunity for teaching, learning, and formation. So to start, and I do this in my paper, I love this quote from Elizabeth Probin, who is an Australian who writes about cultural studies and food. She says this about 20 years ago: "Food culture now seems to spill into every nook and cranny. Love, sex, relationships, family, economics, comfort, obsession, pleasure, control, desire, shame, disgust, fear, hatred, work, leisure, sickness, death, birth, the list could go on and on. All of these disparate aspects of life are at different times touched by food, given meaning through eating. Intensely social, boringly mundane, simple or complicated. At times, eating seemingly connects to the very core of ourselves. At others, it is just a drudge activity necessary to keep body and soul together." That fantastic quote really captures kind of a core of why I find myself developing a focus on food as I move towards my dissertation in religious education and practical theology, and especially food at the level of eating, food culture, identity formation. I think in part this paper is my attempt to flesh out some of the ideas that are shaping what will become a much more focused research project, as these things have to do. So to summarize, some key claims that I was trying to make in this paper. My basic claim is this: that food is a significant site of formation to which we religious educators can pay attention, not only in a critical sense, in a way to be readers of culture critically, but also as a potential path of creative engagement and reformation, a way to become cultural producers, in this case in the area of food and all the things that are connected to it. As I'll say more about below, this is a framework of public pedagogy, the way I'm thinking about it, following very closely my Antron and religious education interest in public and cultural sites of learning and formation that happen in day-to-day life. So food, in my mind, is a kind of public cultural curriculum, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, and certainly sometimes null, that is constantly shaping, forming, habituating all of us. And so it's important to think about first reading that curriculum, becoming critically aware, conscious of it, and second, becoming more intentionally producers of new ways of being through food. So it's, again, to say it again, that's a dual emphasis. One, on the one hand, on developing a critical food consciousness through which learners can gain awareness of the ways that their identity is shaped through their interactions with food, and also an emphasis on the nurturing of creative agency to disrupt oppressive patterns and imagine new ways of being and being together. So to begin to sketch out the some avenues for engaging food as cultural curriculum, I'm drawing on two specific areas of food scholarship represented by two specific claims that I make in the that I quote in the paper. The first one is this beautiful phrase: "Eating is a pedagogical act." That's claim number one. And this comes from a relatively recent area of food studies called food pedagogies, and you can imagine why that would have caught my attention. Basically, those scholars are working at the intersection of adult learning and education theory and cultural studies of food. So people writing in this area have this really rich and creative engagement with food, both as the subject matter of teaching and learning and also as a medium for teaching and learning about other subject matters like critical theory or feminism or something like that are examples of what people are doing. Their engagement with adult learning theory offers, I think, a really generative overlap with religious education's use of those same sources. So that first quote, "Eating is a pedagogical act," comes from a scholar named Jennifer Sumner. She also says this, that eating can be a practice through which we adapt to a dysfunctional industrial food system, but it can also be a practice through which we can learn to think, to resist, and to build an alternative future. That's very attractive to me. Just one example, I do more in the paper, but trying to give a concrete example of this, the notion of taste education is something that a number of these scholars are focused on. One particular study is on programs in schools or communities that are intended to form appreciation for, quote, healthy living by doing taste education. And these programs can actually be analyzed pretty critically for the political ways in such tastes that are being promoted prescriptively are classed and gendered and racialized. And so we want to think critically about what that education towards healthy eating is actually doing on multiple levels. So a whole bunch of scholarship that is really interesting from that area of food pedagogies. The second claim I'm drawing and pulling into the paper is that food systems are racial formation projects. This claim comes from a whole host of food studies scholars that foreground questions of racial formation and coloniality. And then they trace the ways that racism is sustained through food systems, cultures, and practices, as well as ways that people creatively resist oppressive systems and formation projects through food. Again, that dual emphasis. There are multiple scales through which to approach this relationship between race and food. There's the macro food systems, there's sort of the meso food ways or food cultures, and then there's the micro scale of bodies. One can focus generally on questions of food access and food sovereignty. Those are familiar probably concepts and conversations. Some of my interests actually move towards that micro scale of bodies and the sensory and affective nature of taste and eating and everyday bodily experience that happens around food. For example, I'm interested, as one particular question, how whiteness, in that very thick critical sense of the term, is formed and perpetuated through, for example, practices of eating and engaging with so-called ethnic foods, right? And what might be educational practices that could disrupt this often frictionless formation that happens for white folks. So drawing on those two claims and those two sources, my basic proposal for religious education is one that foregrounds the ways we construct ourselves and identities through food, the ways that we are formed through food, the kinds of capacities for ecological, nonviolent, and imaginative existence that we can engage through food. That's a bare bones summary of what I'm trying to do in the paper. So what I want to do now is be more explicit about naming the REA members whose work is informing and inspiring my emergent interests. I'll name 4, though I could name many more. In a way, this is a way of answering the question that was in the conference call for papers: why religious education and not some other discipline? In this work, I think I'm able to say exactly what lights me up so much about doing this work within the context and identifying with religious education as the space that I want to do this work in. So the first one, I imagine it's fairly clear, and I mentioned her already. Marion Tran, especially her book Reset the Heart, this notion of public pedagogy, her engagement with Henry Giroux, et cetera, that shapes my approach to food as a kind of religious education. As you're likely familiar, she's trying to bring consciousness to the pedagogies of violence and disimagination that operate not only in US culture, where she focuses, but also in the practices of religious education themselves, an inward-looking critical look at our work. She even suggests that Christians, in passing, in part of her book, we ought to offer a curriculum of eating. And to my mind, such a curriculum of eating would aim at learners not only becoming critical readers of food culture, as I've said, but also producers of food culture. And she's doing that kind of work in her book, the constructive work also of thinking along those lines. So food then is one particular entry point into the critiques of disimagination and violence, and another entry point into the space to imagine other ways of being. That's how I'm thinking about it. In a similar vein, I'm also very much influenced by Annie Lockhart Gilroy, particularly her contributions to From Lament to Advocacy. And so really her co-editors, Ann Wimberly, other authors in that volume, Sarah Farmer, Nathaniel West, they are also working with this notion of public pedagogy in really generative ways, I think. They emphasize the role for public theologians to engage the curricula that are present in public spaces. So in that sense, they're thinking about offering counter curricula. So this quote is really helpful to me. It is the role then of religious educators to provide a counter curriculum, a curriculum that counters society's curriculum by first calling it out for the lie that it is, lamenting the messages we have internalized, and then countering with public advocacy centered in religious education. And so I'm thinking about ways, first, that addition of lament that she adds to the book, and so does Ann Wimberly, of course, in her first chapter, would just be so rich in, and I'm thinking along with Carl too here, in that process of lament and thinking about these gigantic systems that are so damaging and seem so intractable, lament being a very theological and spiritual movement on the way to thinking now constructively about advocacy and other things that we can do to disrupt those systems. It is, I'm sure, very clear that Carl and I are both just enamored with Jennifer Ayer's work, her most recent book, and of course, in my particular emphasis on food, her Good Food book in 2013. Frankly, I've wondered several times recently if I could just skip the dissertation and go teach her books because she's already done such wonderful work on food and religious education. But I'll name what I heard Carl naming too, her focus on this kind of notion of a critical paideia, a critical way of engaging the virtues, the capacities for ecological inhabitants is her really great way of putting that. So religious educators, she's suggesting, can be leaders in facilitating and developing the kinds of capacities necessary for ecological inhabitants, as we've heard already. Inhabitants invokes, for me, this spiritually grounded, deep settling into one's place as home, coming to know the web of relations that are fundamental to existence. So I find myself wondering how a focus on food's affective and aesthetic materiality might take shape when it's directed towards the capacities that she names: wonder, eros, grief, hope. And I think it's really important that she adds a critical consciousness of systemic injustice, an ability to critique systems is one of those capacities. And so fourth and finally, I'm thinking with and grateful to Courtney Goto, who is my advisor. I mentioned in the paper that it was in TAing her course, doing theology aesthetically, that some of my ideas begin to emerge about taking food specifically as an aesthetic way of engaging theological thinking and knowledge and those kinds of things. So I'm thinking with her plain and religious education of maybe a religious pedagogy of playing with food. One of the things Goto does that I think is so helpful is approaching religious pedagogy in a way that tries to provide safe enough learning communities in which learners and teachers can take risks, in her words, experimenting with ways of being and being together that have not yet become habitual. So I'm wondering if playing aesthetically with food may also be a way to open up possibilities of playing with identities and the histories and communities and structures in which identities are embedded. So it could be that foods, this is from another scholar, the camouflage of mundanity, or the way food is just so ordinary, it tricks us into thinking that nothing is happening, but then we realize it may be this oblique enough angle by which we can get at these weighty subject matters, while also resisting a resort to sort of our very somber sense of goodness, things I mentioned more in the paper. So because of that experience with some of my ideas about food emerging from that course, I'm always thinking about food in a way that is anchored to food's nature as aesthetic and creative and embodied in its modality, along with some of the other ways that we engage food and think about food justice and bigger pictures. So with naming those wells from which I'm drawing, I will bring my presentation to a close, but really anticipate and hope for a conversation from you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very wonderful presentation to Mr. Nelson. So his paper's first theme. Yeah, so as you know, eating is a pedagogical act. Second theme is food systems are racial formation project. Therefore, his interest in this paper is to imagine counter-curricular of food to open up non-violent possibilities for being and living together. A very wonderful presentation. I think his presentation has the meaning of money matter, so and meaning for so food ministry. So any questions and comments about his presentation?
So there's a question in the chat.
Okay, Mark, thank you. Where did this curiosity for food come from? Yeah, I appreciate that. That is a helpful question, partly because I often don't mention this part when I'm working on it because it's just one of those things that kind of floats to the back of my head, partly because when I talk about it, I'm not using language that comes from my tradition and talking about it in a way that would even be familiar to folks in my tradition, but I am a Seventh-day Adventist, as was mentioned. And that's as if you know anything about Adventists, you know that Adventists take food seriously. And I mean that in like a full sense of like at least a double entendre of that term, that take food as a serious part of their religious commitment and formation. And in my experience, have a very serious way of doing that, a somber way. That might also be where some of the things are coming from in my paper and thinking about I'm thinking with Shannon Sullivan in that paper about whiteness, for example, as having this overheated sense of goodness, a way that an affective commitment to being good sometimes trumps actually like doing good things in the world. So that there may be some of that, but it's worth saying that, yeah, I come from that tradition. And so identity and formation and all of those things are so tied to not just notions of food out in the world, but actually just like everyday practices of choosing food. So it's often when we do theology around food, it ends up taking the Eucharist as this beautiful symbol that we can unpack and all of that. And my interests tend to be just in the everyday interaction with food that for some religious folks actually is like a really integral part of their identity formation. But I'm also interested in the way that like culture, food is just such an important part of culture, always has been. And then in sort of the last few decades really has a unique space in culture. So I mentioned at the beginning of the paper, some book that apparently did a survey. I don't know how dependable it is, but the notion I think is dependable and it's interesting. You know, the term foodie used to be a very niche kind of term that kind of was used in a snobby way to define a very certain kind of bourgeois people, right? And in this survey that the author was talking about, millennials and Gen Zers, half of them self-identify with that term foodie, right? So whether that's totally accurate or not, the idea is the notion of being a foodie is just elevated, as you all know, to a serious level. So the engaging food as culture is kind of a part of where my interests come from.
Thanks. Thanks for the wonderful paper, Vaughn, and really enjoyed it. Learned a lot. I'm interested in one. You probably wrote this paper and saw the price of food increase week by week. And what is your sense of? I just wonder, as we address this issue of global inflation, what are the implications in terms of your insights, your paper?
Yeah, that's it's an excellent question. And I mean, part of food studies and food justice scholarship, and Jennifer Ayers talks some about this in her first book, and this is often the place we go, is recognizing that the global industrial food system is not only unjust, but is a racial formation project and contributes to all these kinds of things. It is weighted with histories of colonialism and all these sorts of things. As it becomes more and more difficult, those problems, I think, will just exacerbate. They won't get better, they'll get worse. And for now, and probably on the other side of a dissertation, that's the very kind of, that's part of what I want to teach with a focus on food. And in the meantime, my interest is kind of on that micro level. And I mean, your question is still relevant to that too, right? Because as people are budgeting and making food choices and all those kinds of things, they get challenging on the day-to-day level. So I don't know, Carl, exactly what the implications are for that, but it is interesting, how people make decisions. I mean, maybe one of them is this, and this is where I'm thinking along with you, and maybe we have some overlapping interest, is the tension that I sense you feel, I certainly feel it reading your paper and thinking about my topic, between kind of the urgency of the problems and also the sort of deep kinds of conversion or formation or whatever that are necessary for like lasting change, in tension with the urgency of like, this actually is like now, this has to happen now. And it can't just be, we've been trying to sort of find technological solutions out of this that we can slap on over the top, and that's not working. So I hear Pope Francis, right? This has to be deeper. I think, yeah, somehow that intersects with what I'm thinking about too, but I'm gonna think more.
Yeah.
First, Professor Maureen O'Brien, and next, Professor Ab Rabinovich. session.
Thank you. So, yeah, Vaughn, excellent paper, and most of this is brand new to me, so please forgive what might be a basic sort of question. But in the paper, I didn't see a particular focus on how food is considered healthy or unhealthy. And I just would be interested in hearing more about how that factors in, especially since you identified you have a kind of micro level interest, but also I wondered how the way food is perceived as healthy or unhealthy is related to racialized formation in our culture, for example.
Yeah, that's a great question, Maureen. I am aware that that is a really alive area of scholarship, particularly in your second part of that question, and thinking particularly about the way that notions of healthy food are racialized. I mean, immediately that brings to mind conversations about soul food and the way that soul food is. I mean, soul food is a racial identity that is often used in an oppositional way. So it has this positive characteristic of soul food being like developed as a way of oppositional kind of resistance to norms and everything. And then it often gets kind of stigmatized as unhealthy. So that's one area of conversation that's quite alive as people work on that. I'm also interested in kind of the way, and this is where it intersects probably with my own kind of history growing up in a religious tradition that thinks very seriously about healthy food as a way to be good. And so that really slippery move between choosing to be healthy and then choosing to be healthy as a way of being good and as a way of developing a moral formation, and then recognizing somewhere in there slipped in notions of healthiness that are actually that are treated as universal, but are actually quite particular to maybe a culture way of being or a particular like place or something like that. And then that slips into the identity formation. So that brief reference I had in the presentation, and it's fairly brief in the paper too, is to some folks who are looking at, it may have even been in England. I know there's been some research there. They do this with not only the schools, but also kind of like celebrity chefs who go around. I'll leave him nameless for now, but a celebrity chef in England who goes around kind of teaching people how to be healthy. And it's such a sticky thing, right? Because on the one hand, there's some value to the kinds of orientations, but then there's a lot imported into that with the going to a particular home and teaching. There's economic problems with the way like food costs are for quotes healthy food. There are cultural issues around like what kinds of foods count and things like that. I'm not being very articulate about that, Maureen, but yeah, it's a great question, and there is lots more thinking about that that's available out there, and that is getting closer to kind of some of the things that I want to think more about.
Thank you.
I see you, Abe.
Oh, hi. Thanks for this beautiful presentation. I love the topic. I don't have actually a question. I just have more like a comment. I know you mentioned briefly the Eucharist, and it's very strong there. The words of Jesus, as he said, "You eat the bread, you're eating me." I think those words are so powerful. But I would encourage you to look into ancient Jewish tradition, how they associate with food going back to biblical times. It has a very strong focus on theological focus and a pedagogical focus as well. And you could just go through over the ages and medieval times and Kabbalah, and you end up reading Buber and Hasidic literature. They brought this back, this whole concept of food has a very strong teaching emphasis. So I just wanted to make this comment. I might be above and beyond your dissertation, but it might be worthwhile just to explore.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I agree. I think that's a really useful place to look further.
Thank you.
Professor Russell Dalton has a question to present.
Thanks. I want to thank you both, Vaughn and Carl, both, excellent and thought-provoking presentations. It's interesting for me in terms of formation. My children were raised and exposed to the call of their faith towards justice and towards just action. But to be honest, we never really emphasized food that much growing up, or, of all of the different causes of justice, ecological justice. But somehow the call of their faith, and for them and many of their friends, as they got into their college years especially, was this call that really brought together all of this. You talk about that, is it for personal piety's sake? And that is, for sustainability's sake. They're vegans. They both came up to that decision separately on two sides of the country, going to different colleges. Then going and being involved in, protests, advocacy. My one daughter led the charge for her college to divest in fossil fuels, but and is very involved in the Sunrise Movement. But then they also, she and her friends who do this and got arrested at the State House, different things like that. Then they go out hiking and just this communion with nature for the sake. So, I'm just seeing these connections for formation, both for one's personal reflection, but also, you mentioned, Carl, the 5 Maria Harris's curricular forms, and with my class I add Robert Pazmiño's prophetia, advocacy, and they practice those together, and I see some hope with young people with that. But the urgency still gets to me that old folks my age still are holding back some of the changes, whether it has to do with food, but especially with climate change and our ecological awareness. And I think that's where young people, I think quite a bit, get it. But we really need to reflect. I'm thinking of what you shared and how that can make us think about education and formation and ecological awareness for older adults. Because we don't have time for these young people, to take control of the government as much as the good work of advocacy that they're doing. So I don't know if you have any reactions to that. I realize I could try to turn that into a question, but I don't know if you have any responses to it.
Well, I think you should not underestimate your parenting. And on the impact on your kids, so don't underestimate that. So clearly they are committed to justice in the world, and so that formative process is not only a response to the signs of the time, but probably a response to the formation that they've received. So congrats to you. They're carrying out that proclamation.
Our session time is remained at 15 minutes. So I think to both presenters, we question now. Professor Kathy Winnings, and then next Professor Chart. Professor Kathy Winning, unmute the speaker, please.
Yeah, all right. I'm particularly intrigued, Vaughn, with I've never thought of food in that way. So I'm really intrigued when I looked at your paper. What it raises in me, and the questions and comments been raised, especially by Maureen and the others, is, I mean, I've thought about food in terms of one of my colleagues and best friends calls it food ministry. But what I'm intrigued with is what you're raising on this other issue of the food health and this and that. And I'm looking at this, every major religion, food is central in some ceremony. Hindus, very central. Of course, we knew in Judaism and of course, Christianity and Islam. So we look at the centrality and sacredness of food in ceremonies, and you compare it now to our modern day concern with health and food. So I'd be interested in see how you end up in your dissertation in the balance of the two and what that means in reality, because it does impact also the ceremonies. Look what it's done to communion, wafers, and the juice. Well, already we changed the juice a long time ago from wine to grape juice for the Protestants, for sure. And then even for the Protestants, depending if you go to which Lutheran church you go, whether you use the vinegar kind or the wine or the juice. And I've been to both kinds of churches. So it's interesting how it has even impacted the ceremonial aspect of our use of food. So I'd be interested in how you're having to deal with the emotional, the spiritual, religious sacredness of food, along with the health issues, and how that's going to end up impacting this whole dimension of food and the sanctity of food in that way. I'm just, and in terms of spiritual growth and development of right. Someone's identity. I mean, has that entered and what kind of resources are you going to?
Right.
Really? I mean,
no, that's wonderful. Thank you for those reflections. And even as you're talking about that, you're helping me sort of come to the surface, something that I can maybe say more clearly now. You're absolutely right, of course, that food in most religions has this deep ceremonial nature. And my gut is that, as we have done with so many things, sort of contemporary, let's just call it US culture, but this happens all over the place, in its, its movement through secularity or whatever, ends up substituting sort of these cultural interactions with food for what's missing from, the ways we've lost connection to those deep ceremonial interactions with food. And so my first critical question would be, well, yeah, so if those are substitute ceremonies that are happening when people are Instagramming their meals or, cook, whatever ways we interact with culture, what formation is happening in that what is actually a deep ceremony, but it's a modern, ceremony or whatever that is not given a religious context? What formation is happening is the critical question. And then how can we think creatively about ways to kind of retap the more constructive, imaginative approaches that would be more life-giving, maybe reattaching it to religious wisdom or other ways of just rechanneling and redirecting. And, there's so many activist communities that are thinking and working around this already. How do we tap into the energy that they're already doing? So yeah, thanks for those reflections.
Next, Professor Chuck.
Thank you, Vaughn and Carl, for your papers. Your topics bring to mind food insecurity, food scarcity on the global level, what's happening in Sudan, South Sudan, with 2 million people starving to death before our eyes due to both climate change and the war in Ukraine preventing those precious foods, but also the lack of action on behalf of the international community to intervene as we did with the war in Ukraine. And I bring this up because hunger often isn't understood or seen as violence. Hunger is not often seen as an act of violence, but hunger kills people. And we are seeing people die on a massive scale. The food insecurity locally here in New York, in the Bronx, which is a big part of New York City, 60% of the people in the Bronx are food insecure. And I'm sure that percentage in the Bronx is duplicated elsewhere. I'm sure if you do research in your own community, you're going to find similar kinds of food insecurity, food deserts. My own neighborhood has a food pantry once a month. And it seems that the food and the plenty is out there. We have the deadly sin of gluttony, and we have the antidote to gluttony, not only just referring to food as a consumption, but also the idea of fasting as the antidote. And not only just fasting from food, but fasting from other things. And so we have a major hunger problem in our own country, in my own city here in New York, the wealthiest city in the United States, if not the world, one of the wealthiest in the world. And I just wanted to raise these issues up. I also put in the chat a good article by Douglas Pratt on using food and different cuisines as a metaphor for interreligious prayer and interreligious dialogue. So thanks again for just getting me to think in this way from both your papers.
Thanks, John.
So I have a question to Professor Procario-Foley. So I'm serving a local church in Korea. So I recognize the ecological issues in my local church. However, so when I choose the text and sermon narrative, I used to focus on my church members' self-centered interest, such as their job, searching, they're healthy, their family, they're earning money. So here I can find some gap between both issues. Also, even though ecological issues very, very important. However, usually so many pastors and local churches focuses on their church members' self-centered interest. How do you think about narrowing both interests or some these issues?
Yeah, I think yeah, that's you're getting at an important point. You know that yeah, as in pastoral situations, you seek to be responsive. You know, responsive to the needs of the people, and I think then it's our responsibility then as pastoral people to integrate the needs of the earth into you know, into that conversation. And how do we do that? How do we do that? And I think it's interesting. There's a lot of preaching guides available, resources available to discuss, you know, ecological awareness. So there are resources out there, you know, as preachers, and certainly, you know, I mentioned in my paper the season of creation and the resources available around the season of creation and the themes around that. That's just one of many. But I think you know, I think, you know, I think the interconnectedness of all these, if we can help people see the interconnectedness of all these issues, of, you know, we just the conversation, you know, that, you know, and the comments that Chuck was making about the interconnection of the war in Ukraine and what's happening in Sudan, and you know, the price of food. And so if we can help people into that kind of making those connections, we're getting at that issue. But I understand the challenge you're raising.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we have 5 minutes remaining. So 1 or 2 questions is possible. Comment.
maybe that it's a long enough day that if people don't have more to say, we can always graciously thank you all for attending, and please make sure you fill in the feedback form. And thank you, Dr. Moon-sun, for such an excellent job of moderating.
Please, your comments in feedback form. Oh yeah, questions, Professor Don Harper.
Well, I think those are just clappy hands.
Okay.
They're applauding
It's not a question.
for our
Thank you.
presenters.
I
For
was just
Vaughn and
applauding
Carl.
you.
Thank you so much. A very wonderful presentation, Professor Procario-Foley and Professor Vaughn Nelson. Thank you. God bless.